It is terrifying to see this grey movement of grey shadows, noiseless, silent. A wide use can be predicted for this invention in view of its tremendous originality.
Young man, our invention is not for sale. And besides, it would ruin you. It may be exploited for a while as a scientific curiosity. But apart from that, it has no commercial future.
The place, Melbourne. The year, 1896. The Melbourne Opera House had just added a novelty item to its vaudeville program. Moving pictures, the latest curiosity from abroad. Sydney was not far behind. Said the influential journal, The Bulletin,
Sydney is gradually going mad over this new invention, and the signs are that the cinematograph is going to rage, for a time.
6 months later, The Bulletin made a more confident prediction.
The cinematograph came to Sydney as a passing show that was ready to move on at any moment. But it has now settled down to a permanent institution and taken root.
Showmen rushed to exploit the new invention. They imported projectors, among them the Lumiere cinematograph, which had one special feature. It was a camera and printer, as well as a projector. The first moving pictures ever taken in this country were exposed and printed in a Lumiere camera by Monsieur Maurice Sestier, a Lumiere representative from Paris. His first successful effort, the Melbourne Cup of 1896, from which these stills were taken. Said the Bulletin,
It is something beautifully appropriate that the first Australian picture presented by the new machine should be a horse race.
The Cup was photographed again the following year, as it has been every year since. One of the earliest reasons for cinema's popularity was that it could record for the many events which only the few could attend. This scene at Flemington Racecourse was printed from the original negative shot in 1897. In 1901, the government called on the services of the well-equipped Limelight Department of the Salvation Army to make a cinematographic record of the tour of the Duke and Duchess of York. The Melbourne establishment cheered the royal couple on their way to open the first Commonwealth Parliament. If Australia was not the only country using the new invention to record historic occasions, she was in the forefront of another, more unusual kind of actuality filming. Walter Baldwin Spencer, Professor of Biology at Melbourne University, pioneer anthropologist. In 1901, Baldwin Spencer took a bioscope camera on a research trip to Central Australia, and an Edison phonograph as well.
April the 3rd, 1901.
Baldwin Spencer had no panning device for his tripod, so he couldn't follow the dancers when they went out of frame. His footage was discovered at the National Museum in Melbourne, one of the oldest ethnographic film records in the world. Australia had an early eminence in another field of filmmaking, the religious spectacle. In the year 1900, the Salvation Army presented Soldiers of the Cross in the Melbourne Town Hall, later in other cities and towns. This has sometimes been claimed as the first feature film. but it was not a continuous moving picture. A series of episodes portrayed the martyrdoms of the early Christians in the days of Imperial Rome. Sections of movie film ran for 2 or 3 minutes. Then the story continued with colored slides. From film to slides, from slides to film. It was a whole evening's program, accompanied by a commentary, by exhortations to prayer, and by a specially arranged music score. It may not have been the first feature, but it was still a remarkable achievement. And its inspiration came from a man who recognized the potentialities of the medium long before most of his contemporaries, Herbert Booth. Booth was the son of the founder of the Salvation Army. In 1896, his father had sent him to Australia as Army Commandant. At the headquarters in Burke Street, Melbourne, he was fascinated with the Limelight Department, which, under the direction of Major Joseph Perry, made magic lantern slides for Army meetings.
For a long time it had appeared to me that in the lantern lay a new way to the heart. I saw at a glance that the living pictures, worked in conjunction with life model slides, would provide a combination unfailing in its power of connecting narrative. In Major Perry, I found not only an experienced lanternist and photographer, but an enthusiast with a like faith.
Technically skilled and having great flair for improvisation, Perry proved the ideal collaborator. His son, Reg, tells of his part in the production.
One of my earliest memories is when, as a lad of 9, I was kept home from school and taken to the Salvation Army Girls' Home at Murrumbeena, where my father, the late J.H. Perry, was making a picture called Soldiers of the Cross. I was dressed in a Roman toga and asked to recant or jump into the lime pit. I jumped into the pit. On another occasion, my elder brother and I, dressed as a lion, and approached the poor Christians kneeling in the centre of the arena, which waiting to be devoured. And we clamped the jaws on one of the victims, probably one of my own sisters. On the wire netting of the tennis court were hung the various backgrounds for the scenes, such as the homes of the Christians, the prison cells, and the arena where the lions devoured the Christians. The various parts were taken by members of the Salvation Army and included members of our own family. The sets and costumes are also made by the Salvation Army, and the set of Perpetua before the proconsul compares very favourably with sets of a similar nature in pictures of later years.
Despite intensive searches, no copy of the film has been found. But most of the original 200 slides are in the National Library, Canberra. With stills from the film, they give some idea of the ingenuity and imagination which went into the production. It spared nothing in savagery and must have had a powerful impact on audiences unused to film of any kind.
I predict for these pictures a great ministry. They will bring many tears, and they will create an influence in the world which will tell marvelously for God.
The Limelight Department went on making short films and slides for some years to come. But in 1901, Herbert Booth had left Australia to become a private evangelist in America. And without his creative drive, the Salvation Army never again attempted a production on the scale of Soldiers of the Cross. In the early years of the century, moving pictures were still, more often than not, just one attraction on a vaudeville program. Theatres like the Old Tivoli in Sydney showed films as chasers to empty the crowd for the next performance, a device which often misfired.
One of the gems of the evening was a film, The Blacksmith's Daughter. Although it was last on the list, the audience became so engrossed that not a single person left the theatre.
But the new class of film showmen soon disregarded established theatres. They went after a different clientele, often people who had never been inside a theatre of any kind before. Tent shows were common in the suburbs, like this one at North Sydney.
My brothers established a tent show in Mount Street, North Sydney. They exhibited with a limelight plant. My job was to take the money at the door. Prices in those days was 3p and 6p. After the money had been taken, then I used to go behind and help with the sound effects. Now, we also had, in the early days, a pianist. This was increased to a 5-piece orchestra. And it was well appreciated because the people come from all parts to see Macintyre's pictures.
The new showman took films to schools of arts and mechanics institutes all over the country.
22nd of February, 1909. Dear Maud, we had a very good night in Bulli. We took £10 1 and 7p, and it was raining very heavy during the evening. Dear Maud, very fine weather last night, but we didn't do so well. We only took £5 15 and 3p.
For projection light, they carried limelight burners, generating a highly explosive mixture of oxygen and hydrogen to heat a block of quicklime to incandescence. Some showmen ran a lucrative sideline, filming street scenes in towns and suburbs, then rushing to develop them to show to the inhabitants. In this case, Hawthorne, Melbourne, in 1906. Local firms paid for the privilege of appearing. Open-air cinema in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia. The public appetite for films was ravenous, and seats were cheap compared with the theatre. No wonder, as the Melbourne Argus said in 1911,
In the world of public entertainment, nothing in recent years has been so remarkable as the rise and development of the cinematograph.
sporting events were certain money spinners. The Burns-Johnson World Championship fight at the Sydney Stadium on Boxing Day, 1908. The Melbourne Football Final, 1909. South Melbourne versus Carlton. What you might have seen on a night at the pictures. About a dozen short films, arranged, as the Bulletin put it,
on the sandwich principle, with a slice of touching pathos interlarded between two slabs of broad comedy.
In city theatres, they were usually accompanied by an orchestra.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now present The Story of the Kelly Gang, the longest film ever made.
Was this the world's first feature film? There's a great deal of evidence to support the claim. 4,000 feet of film, at silent speed, about 1 hour and 20 minutes. This at a time when America was still making mainly 1 and 2 reel dramas, and 2 years before the French began to make long film versions of classic plays. It opened at the Melbourne Town Hall on Boxing Day, 1906. The producers were the Tate brothers of Melbourne, theatrical entrepreneurs and film exhibitors. Charles Tate wrote the script and acted as director to cameramen Johnson and Gibson. The Bulletin's comment,
The Tate brothers, who look so deceptively young and innocent, have discovered in a moment of inspiration that the most vital spot in Australia's national character is its weakness for the Kelly gang.
She's on the way. Come on, give us a hand with this rail. Hurry up there.
Voices behind the screen spoke dialogue, and a man manipulated sound effects. So enthusiastically that the Bulletin complained,
"There is a deal too much racket in connection with the show. Sometimes you can't see the pictures for the noises of horses, trains, gunshots, and wild cries."
No copy of the film is known to survive, only these stills in a booklet issued at its first release. It also has a description of the plot. The closing scene has the ring of classical tragedy.
He is seen approaching from the bush, and the troopers fire shot after shot at the tall, silent figure. But the shots seem to take no effect except to cause him to stagger. Ned Kelly at bay. The capture. Thus falls the last of the Kelly gang, and with the fall of Ned Kelly, the last of the bushrangers.
The Kelly film was tremendously popular wherever it was shown. It inspired a whole school of Australian filmmaking on Australian themes, most of them longer than anything coming from abroad. The Bulletin, in 1908,
they prove that as motion picture builders, Australians are not eclipsed by the best French and Yankee films.
Moving pictures were born at a time when a sense of national identity was beginning to flower. Australians already had their own folk heroes, and showmen were not slow to exploit them. A new director had entered the film scene, Raymond Longford. He was to prove the most able and original of all the early filmmakers. This was his second film, and it's the earliest Australian feature of which any part survives. It's a romanticized version of the adventures of a real-life character, a woman convict who was transported in 1801 for stealing a horse to help her lover escape. Raymond Longford, the face of a dreamer. Yet he had an adventurous youth at sea and was a ship's officer before becoming a professional actor. He was in his middle 30s when he first entered films. He played in 3 films for Cousins Spencer, who became the leading producer of the pre-war years. In 1910, Spencer allowed him to direct. By 1920, he had made 19 features, all distinguished by a subtlety of acting unusual for its time.
The true art of acting is not to act. That's what I've dinned into the ears of my characters, and I think it has had its effect in the naturalness of my pictures.
Lottie Lyle, who played the main role in Margaret Catchpole and became the best-known silent film actress in Australia. She played in most of Longford's films and helped him with editing and as a business partner. The few surviving examples we have of her work show a warm, intelligent actress with the ability to suggest the inner depths of a character. She died of tuberculosis in 1925 at the age of 34. Cousins Spencer gathered a company of skilled technicians. As cameramen, the Higgins, 3 talented brothers from Tasmania, whose names are scattered thickly through the credit titles of silent features. Ernest was the eldest. Tasman was the middle brother. Arthur, the youngest, photographed Margaret Catchpole. In the days before arc lights, interiors were shot in open-air studios like these in Sydney. Vast muslin ceilings diffused the light and eliminated shadows to suit the style of photography thought desirable at the time. So successful had Cousins Spencer been that he built a costly glass-roofed studio at Rushcutters Bay, Sydney. It was opened on the 16th of August, 1912, and Spencer voiced the optimism of the young industry when he wrote in the souvenir program,
"There is every reason to believe that prosperous times are ahead for a firm that can turn out pictures with a purely Australian atmosphere."
Unfortunately, Spencer was soon to withdraw from film production, although the studios were used for many years. Martin Place, Sydney, in 1912. Australia was a burgeoning, prosperous nation, anxious, perhaps over-anxious, for the rest of the world to know her. How better than through the new medium of moving pictures? In April 1913, the Department of External Affairs invited applications from cinematographers
in connection with advertising the Commonwealth of Australia.
The successful applicant, Bert Ive of Queensland. The Department of Cinematography, which he established, was the forerunner of the Commonwealth Film Unit. Of all the many actuality films we know to have been made in the silent days, few remain. But the National Library has preserved some of great historical interest. This was a record of the day in March 1913 when politicians, officials and men of high degree converged on the centre of 900 square miles of sheep country in southern New South Wales. The film was directed by Raymond Longford and photographed by Bert Ive and Ernest Higgins. In 1917, a railway strike began in New South Wales and spread throughout the country. Some unknown cameraman recorded these scenes of Union solidarity, probably one of the earliest Australian newsreels of an industrial conflict. In 1911, a then unknown young photographer by the name of Frank Hurley had talked his way into a job with Dr. Douglas Mawson's expedition to Antarctica. On a summer's day in December, the expedition vessel Aurora sailed south from Hobart. Hurley shot his material under great difficulties, but it showed the pictorial brilliance for which he was to become famous, as well as being one of the earliest photographic records of Antarctica. "1914. The movie camera had a grimmer actuality to record. Cameraman Bert Ive travelled part of the way with the 1st Gallipoli contingent. For many of the young Australians he photographed, it was to be a one-way journey. Despite the fact that thousands of Australian troops were fighting in France, British censorship policy prevented the accreditation of any Australian war photographers. But the workload became too great for the British correspondents, and in 1917, Frank Hurley, just back from his third Antarctic trip, was appointed official photographer to the AIF. He was given an assistant, Lieutenant Hubert Wilkins of the Australian Flying Corps, who once worked as a projectionist in that tent theatre in North Sydney, but who had already begun the career of scientific exploration, which was to win him fame and a knighthood. At the end of 1917, Frank Hurley was posted to the Middle East, where he filmed the Australian Light Horse, on manoeuvres in the desert, and in the capture of the ancient cities of Beersheba, Gaza, Jericho, and Damascus, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Harry Chauvel. Far from reducing movie production at home, the war stimulated it. Spy dramas, soldiering adventures, tales of heroines behind the lines. They all helped set the recruiting mood and were encouraged by the government. Cartoon film was used as official recruiting propaganda in 1917. The war cut off some of the largest sources of film supply, the English and European studios, and indirectly influenced the decision of the well-known theatrical firm of J.C. Williamson to embark upon movie production. The firm made 6 films during the war years. Most of them were shot in Melbourne and were based on the plays it had already presented on the stage. American high society melodramas, built around large houses, and ladies in elegant gowns. The world of maidservants, and of menservants, and of comical policemen. Officer 666 starred and was directed by Fred Niblo, the well-known American actor who later became a leading Hollywood director. In this scene, Fred Niblo shows the flair which made him one of J.C. Williamson's most popular actors during the few years he spent in Australia. Australian films of the first few decades were mostly aimed at the local market. Local distribution was enough to make a good profit. And although ignored by J.C. Williamson's and others, Australian themes were the mainstream of production, reflecting the hunger of people to see their own environment, to hear about themselves, to nourish their ego on their national myths and stereotypes. Nostalgia for the pastoral life was still part of every Australian's makeup, whether city or country bred. The squatter melodrama was one of the commonest themes for films. The upstanding young hero, usually a jackaroo. The villain who preferred a life of dissipation. The heroine over whom they fight. Girl of the Bush is one of the few examples to survive. It's notable for its excellent documentary portrayal of station life, the result perhaps of Franklin Barrett's many years of experience as an actuality cameraman. country life far removed from that of the squattocracy. Raymond Longford wrote his own scenario from Steele Rudd's Tales of a Struggling Selector and His Family, part of the literary tradition of bush humour which had been nurtured by the Bulletin. Often funny, sometimes tragic, the film drew a warm response from audiences who saw the well-loved characters come to life. Longford's aim was to preserve the spirit of the original stories, unlike the Bowdlerized stage version, which had appeared some years before. Australian filmmakers made good use of their natural environment. The sunlit bush is as much the star of the 1920 Robbery Under Arms as Captain Starlight and the Marstons. Not all films were set in the bush. The Hordern Mystery had a sophisticated Sydney setting. Although it was based on a novel, the acting style, like that of so many early films, was still strongly influenced by stage melodrama. Already in 1920, a shadow was falling over the industry. The first 2 decades had been a period of intensive activity when more than 150 features had been made. Although few of the production companies were able to keep afloat on filmmaking alone. While for the film directors, it was always a precarious existence. A few directors did manage to remain independent, like Franklin Barrett, one of the most prolific filmmakers. He shared Longford's passionate belief in the value of Australian subjects, and he was one of the earliest advocates of some form of government assistance to the industry. In the early days, films had at least been cheap to make, and distribution easy to arrange. But across the Pacific, another much larger film industry had boomed. The little Australian units had more and more to compete against technical sophistication and budgets beyond their dreams. Huge new theatres were being planned. In 1920, picture attendances in Australia totaled 67.5 million, more than 13 times the entire population of the continent. The figures had not been lost on the Hollywood corporations, and they were moving swiftly to tie up their distribution outlets. The first era was drawing to a close. Crude as some of the efforts had been, the best of them expressed a genuinely Australian ethos. But it had been the age of innocence for local filmmaking, and perhaps never again would it have that unself-conscious pride in its own achievements, that naive determination to give it a go of the early days. But the era was to culminate in a production considered by many to be one of Australia's few claims to a film classic. Raymond Longford, who directed it, has told how he had to hawk the idea about before he could find a backer. Yet the film was a huge financial and artistic success, not only in Australia, but in England. The London Daily Express, in its review,
"If Australia can keep up this standard, a new and very serious competitor will enter the world's film markets."
What was the secret of the film's appeal? Some of it the poetry, from the book by C.J. Dennis, which many people knew by heart. Some of it the beautiful photography of Arthur Higgins in the streets of Sydney and Woolloomooloo, in the homely sets for the cottage interiors. But most of it lay in the film's warmly human qualities, in the wry, down-to-earth characterizations, the very opposite of the conventional heroines and villains of the Hordern mystery. The story concerns a hawker known as the Kid and his mate Ginger Mick. One day they're caught in a two-up raid. Soon after his spell in prison, the Kid sees a girl at the markets. But a mutual friend arranges an introduction. Romance blossoms on a trip to Manly. And on a visit to Romeo and Juliet. Then jealousy rears its head, with the appearance of the straw hat Coot. For a while, the romance is under a cloud. But there's an unexpected meeting at a party. love triumphs.
Now to the digressing a little bit back to the business, I would like to see it go ahead, particularly in Australia in a very, very big degree. The making of pictures such as televisions they speak about today that I'm not familiar with. I would like to see it go ahead with leaps and bounds, and particularly the good Australian stories, stories indigenous to Australia, full of sentiment. After all said and done, aren't we all sentimentalists? And as myself, well, I'm the sentimental bloke.